So, quick review. So, last week we started the story of Daniel, and the book of Daniel really follows, of course, his story as well as his friends' stories, commonly known as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And so that's what tonight is about, is their story. And so they are among the best and brightest out of Judah that are taken among the first wave of exiles to Babylon. This is when the southern half of God's people, so if you remember, Israel was the whole land, then it gets divided into Israel and Judah. Israel goes first into exile under Assyria, and now the southern half, Judah, goes into exile in Babylon. It's very possible that Daniel and his friends may have been even serving as eunuchs in Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon's court. And so we talked about this last week. They are really a model for the Jewish people in the time of the exile. So basically the way that they carry themselves, the decisions that they make is really a model for the rest of the exiles. So they would look at these stories for, okay, how do I live now that this is my reality? This is kind of my lot in life. You know, before there was WWJD, there's probably WWDD. What did Daniel do, right? And so all four of these characters you see as they go through these stories, you see this balance of respect and honor to the kings that they serve, right? But never at the expense of their convictions and their God. So it is possible, believe it or not, and I think this is the lesson that we can all learn right now. It is possible to live among a people with whom you disagree, right? It is possible to live in an environment when you're the minority and when you feel like an outsider and still respectfully get along while holding to your convictions. And I wonder if we get this today, because today it seems like everything is divisive and everything is caused to part ways and, you know, cancel somebody else. And so for Daniel and his friends, things go well for the most part. But as we see, there are those times when you do need to make a decision. And we'll see it today for Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. We'll see it later for Daniel himself. And so you can try your hardest to get along and be cordial. And every now and then you might get pushed into a decision where you kind of have to draw a line in the sand. And so I think it's up to us to know when those times are. So when we are called to be good neighbors and to be respectful and humble, and then also honestly to know when are those kind of pretty rare times where you have to kind of draw that line. And I want to emphasize that they're rare because I think nowadays our tendency is to make everything a line in the sand. Like everything is caused to divide, everything is caused to cancel each other, that sort of thing. And honestly, I think those times are relatively rare, and for the most part, we actually can get along with each other even if we don't always agree on everything. Amen? So I want to do something a little bit different today. The passage is not quite as long as some of the others have been, and so we've got a little bit of margin with our time. So what I'd like to do is kind of read the entire story as one chunk and just kind of take it in as a story before we dissect it together. So bear with me. I'm going to read all of chapter 3. Here we go. King Nebuchadnezzar made an image of gold 60 cubits high and 6 cubits wide and set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. He then summoned the satraps, prefects, governors, advisors, treasurers, judges, magistrates, and all the other provincial officials to come to the dedication of the image he had set up. So the satraps, prefects, governors, advisors, treasurers, judges, magistrates, and all the other provincial officials assembled for the dedication of the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up, and they stood before it. You're going to notice this. Just go ahead and just take note of it as we read. There's lots of repetition in this chapter. Then the herald loudly proclaimed, "Nations and peoples of every language, this is what you are commanded to do. As soon as you hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipe, and all kinds of music, you must fall down and worship the image of gold that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. Whoever does not fall down and worship will immediately be thrown into a blazing furnace." Therefore, as soon as they heard the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, and all kinds of music, all the nations and peoples of every language fell down and worshiped the image of gold that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. At this time, some astrologers came forward and denounced the Jews. They said to King Nebuchadnezzar, "May the king live forever. Your majesty has issued a decree that everyone who hears the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipe, and all other kinds of music must fall down and worship the image of gold. and that whoever does not fall down and worship will be thrown into a blazing furnace. But there are some Jews whom you have set over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who pay no attention to you, your majesty. They neither serve your gods nor worship the image of gold you have set up. Furious with rage, Nebuchadnezzar summoned Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So these men were brought before the king, and Nebuchadnezzar said to them, "Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the image of gold I have set up? Now, when you hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipe, and all kinds of music," listen, if this story didn't have the repetition, it'd be like a third as long, right? All kinds of music. "If you are ready to fall down and worship the image I have made, very good. But if you do not worship it, you will be thrown immediately into a blazing furnace. Then what God will be able to rescue you from my hand?" Sorry, excuse me. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to him, "King Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to deliver us from it, and he will deliver us from your majesty's hand. But even if he does not, we want you to know, your majesty, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you have set up." Then Nebuchadnezzar was furious with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and his attitude toward them changed. He ordered the furnace heated 7 times hotter than usual and commanded some of the strongest soldiers in his army to tie up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and throw them into the blazing furnace. So these men, wearing their robes, trousers, turbans, and other clothes, were bound and thrown into the blazing furnace. The king's command was so urgent and the furnace so hot that the flames of the fire killed the soldiers who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and these 3 men, firmly tied, fell into the blazing furnace. Then King Nebuchadnezzar leapt to his feet in amazement and asked his advisors, "Weren't there 3 men we tied up and threw into the fire?" They replied, "Certainly, your majesty." He said, "Look, I see 4 men walking around in the fire, unbound and unharmed, and the 4th looks like a son of the gods." Nebuchadnezzar then approached the opening of the blazing furnace and shouted, "Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out, come here." So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out of the fire, and the satraps, prefects, governors, and royal advisors crowded around them. They saw that the fire had not harmed their bodies, nor was a hair of their heads singed, their robes were not scorched, and there was no smell of fire on them. Then Nebuchadnezzar said, "Praise be to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and rescued his servants. They trusted in him and defied the king's command, and were willing to give up their lives rather than serve or worship any god except their own God. Therefore, I decree that the people of any nation and language who say anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be cut into pieces and their houses turned into piles of rubble, for no other God can save in this way." Then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. So that is our territory for tonight. And I don't know, you can tell me later. I think sometimes it's helpful to kind of just take a sweep at the story first before we just really dissect each and every piece of it. So you'll kind of have the whole picture as we go into it. So let's go into it. Verse 1 said, "King Nebuchadnezzar made an image of gold 60 cubits high and 6 cubits wide and set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon." So it's hard to know what the image may have actually been, right? If it was a god, for instance, it wouldn't have been by itself in a plain. It would have been close to or inside a temple. And so that's where worship of the gods happen. That's where sacrifices happen, things like that. So it'd be kind of abnormal for a statue of a god to be out in the plain somewhere. So it's probably not a Babylonian god. It's possible, of course, that it's Nebuchadnezzar himself. And the idea is that you would put up a statue sometimes on the frontiers of your empire so that you can encourage the newly conquered peoples to take a loyalty oath right there in front of the representation of you, right? And so it could be Nebuchadnezzar. Of course, we see in the story that not only is bowing a part of the expectation and maybe taking a loyalty oath will be part of it, but also worshiping the statue is a part of it. And so, of course, that's going to be a problem for Daniel and his friends. And actually, Daniel's not in this story, but for his friends. So let's talk about the dimensions of the statue for a second. It says that it's 60 cubits high and it's 6 cubits wide. That's 90 feet high and 9 feet wide. But don't miss this. The height is 10 times the width of the statue, which kind of makes for a little bit of a comical image here, right? So I asked ChatGPT to look at this for me, and this is kind of the proportions of what it could have been, right? So it's a weird comical sort of image. I wonder how it even stays up. How stable is something like that, right? Of course, there are people who think that it probably did have a pedestal on the bottom, but even with a pedestal, it's still kind of comical, right? It's like, you just wonder. And so, I think the point here is not necessarily exactly what it looked like or how it stood or exactly what it was, but the point is, we have something pretty ridiculous and self-serving in mind from Nebuchadnezzar, right? Does that make sense? So the whole thing is gold. It's a ridiculous proportion. It's huge, but and so we should have this kind of absurd idea of what Nebuchadnezzar wants probably for himself in this story. And so that characterization of Nebuchadnezzar kind of continues in this chapter. So funny thing, there was a Roman historian in the late 200s AD, so this would be several hundred years after this story. His name was Hippolytus of Rome, and he reflects back on the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And what he suggests is that Nebuchadnezzar loved the statue from the previous chapter. So the previous chapter was Daniel interpreting his dream, right? And we had that many-layered statue that we think represents a number of different kingdoms, right? And so that was this statue here. And so Hippolytus suggests that Nebuchadnezzar was just enamored with the fact that he was the head of gold. Right? Doesn't matter anything else about the vision or about how unstable this would have been and how it comes crashing down in the vision itself. He's like, oh, so I'm the head of gold, you say, right? And so he's like, I should probably build that statue. So that's him just speculating, but I think it's kind of a hilarious story that would be Nebuchadnezzar's takeaway from the previous chapter is, I like that head of gold, I should probably build it. So we really have no idea what it is, but I just think it's a kind of a funny story. So verse 2. He then summoned the satraps. I had to look that one up. That's the kind of local rulers of the provinces. The prefects, governors, advisors, treasurers, judges, magistrates, and all the other provincial officials to come to the dedication of the image he had set up. So, speaking of repetition, the satraps, prefects, governors, advisors, treasurers, judges, and magistrates, and all the provincial officials assembled for the dedication of the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up, and they stood before it. So again, you're going to notice lots of things that are repeated, and almost repeated word for word. So verse 2 really shows you who Nebuchadnezzar summoned. Verse 3 says, hey, they showed up. But it basically says it almost in the exact wording once again. And so if you're reading this, it seems a little bit unnecessary, and we're going to come back to maybe why it's written this way. We'll come back to that in just a little bit. So it was common, let me get to the next verse. Verse 4. Then the herald loudly proclaimed, nations and peoples of every language, this is what you are commanded to do. So it's common for the kings of the time to really exaggerate their reign and their realm, right? And so is the herald really talking to the nations and the peoples of every language? No. But when kings would kind of promote themselves, they would really embellish who they were, who they conquered, or how far their reign extended. And so they would make pronouncements kind of like this, every people, every language. Here's what the herald said. Verse 5, as soon as you hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipe, and all kinds of music, you must fall down and worship the image of gold that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. Whoever does not fall down and worship will immediately be thrown into a blazing furnace. So let's talk about the furnace just for a minute. It's kind of unlikely that they would have had a furnace there simply as a tool of punishment. So you don't see this very often. I mean, every now and then you do. It could be a tool of torture or execution, things like that, but actually not very often. They had other things that they would prefer to use in terms of execution than just kind of burning someone. So that's really not why the furnace is there. The furnace is there probably because of the work that they're already doing with the statue. So the statue has all sorts of gold and things like that, and so they could have been there for melting metals. It could have been there for baking bricks. And so there's already a furnace there. So the punishment kind of presents itself as just a convenient choice. Hey, we have this thing here. It's certainly a deterrent, right? It's undesirable. So we're just going to go ahead and make that also the punishment in addition to the thing we're working with every single day. So the furnace itself, It may have looked something like this. Some people think that there could have been kind of like a dome sort of thing on top of it. But most likely what it would have had is certainly the top would have been open at some point for exhaust. On the bottom pedestal where those bricks are, there's probably vents somewhere for the air intake to get to it. And then somewhere in the construction, there's probably like a billow sort of system to raise and decrease the temperature as you needed it to be. And we'll see the temperature raise here in just a few minutes. All right, verse 7. Therefore, as soon as they heard the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, and all kinds of music, all the nations and peoples of every language fell down and worshiped the image of gold that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. So let's talk about the instruments real quick. There's this list of instruments that keeps getting repeated over and over and over again. And what's interesting is that if you study kind of the uniqueness of each instrument, you would realize that these are played in very, very different environments. So some of these instruments are really associated with kind of the upper echelon of society. Some are kind of like peasants' instruments, you would say. And so you probably would not find all of these in one orchestra, right? The point is, though, that everybody should be involved in this command, right? From the greatest to the least, no matter who you are, where you're from. And so if you were to say now that everybody should join into this from the palace harpsichord to the Appalachian banjo player, right? It's kind of like the breadth of what the command is. Nothing wrong with the banjo, by the way. But that's kind of the breadth. So if you think of the top echelon of society and then just the mountain folks playing the banjo, right? Everybody should be involved. That sounded like a judgment. I didn't mean to sound like a judgment, but anyway, I love the banjo. Verse 8, at this time, some astrologers came forward and denounced the Jews. So here's an interesting language thing happening when it says denounce the Jews. I think you'll just kind of find this funny. So the word we're translating as denounced is an Aramaic phrase. Don't forget, this part of the Bible is written in Aramaic. So everything else in the Old Testament is Hebrew, but there was a small section of Daniel in Aramaic. And so the denounced is this Aramaic phrase, akal keretz, which literally means to eat the pieces off someone. Isn't that nasty? So it's related to the same word for horsefly. So if you can think of kind of like a real sharp, painful, irritating bite, that's kind of what they're getting at, but it becomes this Aramaic idiom for to accuse someone. So the next time you're accused of something and it's really irritating, think of someone trying to like literally take bites of pieces off of you, because that's what they were thinking. So anyway, to accuse, that's what they have for denounce the Jews. Verse 9. They said to King Nebuchadnezzar, may the king live forever. This is them saying, long live the king, right? So that's what they come in saying, long live the king. Your majesty has issued a decree, and everyone who hears it, hears the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipe, and all kinds of music, must fall down and worship the image of gold. And that whoever does not fall down and worship will be thrown into a blazing furnace. But there are some Jews whom you have set over the affairs of the province of Babylon. Let's pause there. So at this point, I think they're trying to pressure King Nebuchadnezzar, because what they're saying is this is more than just an average Joe not doing what they're supposed to do. You've actually given them a sweet deal, right? So these are exiles. You've set them over things. You've given them a good position, and even still, they're ignoring what you have said. So this takes Nebuchadnezzar from just irritation or feeling disrespected to now it's like he feels betrayed because he has done something for them. So there are some Jews you've set up the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who pay no attention to you, your majesty. They neither serve your gods nor worship the image of gold that you have set up. So we've taken another round of the instruments one more time. And so let's take a break and talk about the repetition that we see in the story. It's there. It's like hard not to notice. If you're reading it, you're just like, okay, we get it. We get it. You know, you keep going over and over it. So verse 1 and 2, for instance, if you look back there, they have this repetition of who is summoned by the king, right? And who shows up. Then you have the repetition of the instruments. Then you have the repetition of the punishment. It always keeps going back to thrown into the blazing furnace, right? So there are a few kind of interesting explanations for this. I kind of took a deep dive in this because it just had me I was just so interested in what was going on. So a few explanations. One is that it really just reiterates Nebuchadnezzar's level of power. So in that what he wants, he gets down to the exact word or command, right? This is the amount of power he has. They're going to do what he says down to the exact word. So some of these things that are repeated, they reflect the king's will, the king's desires for the situation. So the people that he summons, the instructions for the instruments, the punishment that he desires are all going to be enforced exactly as he has given them. So we're going to come back in a minute and talk about how things are different when Yahweh, when Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego's God, when he shows his power versus how Nebuchadnezzar chooses to reveal his power. So again, Nebuchadnezzar, repetitive, saying the same things over and over again, and we'll see the God of Israel is different here in just a minute. Another explanation was that this was all at one point oral storytelling. And what's really helpful in oral storytelling is repetition. So I think back to Genesis 1, and I think of the days in Genesis 1. So if you read the creation story, it'll say, and God made this, and God saw that it was good, and it was evening and morning the first day. And then it'll do it again, and God made this, and God saw it. So 6 times it does kind of the same formula, probably because that was an oral story before it was put to pen and paper in the book of Genesis. Does that make sense? So repetition helps when you don't have it in front of you or when you frankly just can't read it all. And so it helps you remember what's going on. So this is also really helpful if you think of, Heather will appreciate this, the whole preschool will appreciate this. Think of like children's books, right? And the amount of repetition that is in children's books. So one of my favorite books to read, I'm wondering if we have this in the preschool hallway, to Zoe when she was young, was this book called Roar of a Snore. Do you guys have this back there? Have you never heard this? Oh, you need to get it. So I think I loved reading this more than Zoe loved hearing it. I truly, this is like one of my favorite things. I'd be like, can we read this book to you? No, read another one. No, I want to read this one. Let's do this one instead. So Roar of a Snore tells the story of this farmhouse family that's trying to go to sleep, but their son Jack is kept up by someone or something that is snoring like crazy. And so it keeps him up at night, and he goes through the house investigating, trying to find out who is snoring or what is snoring. And each time he wakes someone or something up to realize it's not them. And so what does he do? He adds them to the investigation party as he continues going around the house. And so it starts off with just Jack and his dog Blue. And then as he adds people, the reader, me, whoever's reading, is going to repeat who was involved every single time and then add the one more person that he adds. So, for instance, at the beginning of the story, it says Blue and Jack went searching. And then it says Blue and Jack and Mama Gwen went searching. By the time the end of the story goes, let's see if I can remember it, it's Blue and Jack and Mama Gwen. Oh, no. I gotta look. Blue and Jack and Mama Gwen and Baby Sue and Papa Ben and Josie Joe and Jenny Lynn and Sheep and Goat and Cow and Hens went searching. I almost had it. I love this book more than Zoe did. I love this book. And each time you've repeated the search party exactly and you've added the one more. And so this is oral storytelling, right? This is helpful for children to learn and grasp what's going on, but really for any story that's only going to be told orally, this is really, really helpful. So this is one of those things to say, this was probably an oral story before it was put down on paper. If you can handle it, I've got one more explanation for the repetition.
Who was snoring?
Oh, you got to read the book. No, it was the cat. I love that you got stuck on that. It was, I think it's a kitten.
You can't not finish the story.
I think they all go to the barn, and it's a kitten somehow snoring so that it wakes everybody on the whole farm property up, So I'll do it. I'll read it to them. Yep. I don't know about every day, but I'll be happy to read it to him. I love that book. Roar of a Snore. I'll get you the Amazon link. All right, so one more explanation. And honestly, like I said, I kind of took a deep dive because it was so interesting to me. And it could be any one of these explanations, or maybe it could be all of them together, why these things are repeated. So scholars think the repetition could actually be, even for a little bit of humor, value. As in, like you read the same people and the same commands and the same instruments and the same punishments over and over and over again, and it kind of makes Nebuchadnezzar look a little bit small and a little bit petty every single time you read one of those, right? Like, as in, if you have to assert yourself over and over and over again like that, then are you really the one in charge? And so if you take this into account and then you combine it with things like the statue's ridiculous size and proportions, the extreme punishment, the villainous temper that he has, everything around the king starts to look a little bit absurd, right? And he's almost like a comical villain in this story. And so you put all that stuff together and you get, like I said, you get this kind of villainous view of the king, but to an absurd point, right? And so it could be for some humor value. And here's what's interesting. I told you we'd come back to. You can look at Nebuchadnezzar and his staff, repeating themselves over and over and over again. And then you contrast it at the end of the story with God's ability to act once and act decisively, right? And that's how he saves. So again, somebody has to repeat themselves over and over and over and over again. God acts once, God acts decisively, that's it. And so if you wonder, you have this view of almost pettiness and insecurity on one side, and then you have this view of confidence and real power and real action on the other. And so it kind of sets God and Nebuchadnezzar on either side. All right, we'll move on. Verse 13. Furious with rage, Nebuchadnezzar, again, he's got that villainous temper, right? Nebuchadnezzar summoned Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So these men were brought before the king, and Nebuchadnezzar said to them, "Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego?" Repeats their names over and over again, too. It's kind of funny. "Is it true that you did not serve my gods or worship the image of gold that I have set up?" So it's interesting that he has to ask this question, because what you're going to see in the book of Daniel is that there are lessons about the Jewish people and about Daniel and his friends that the king should really be learning by now, right? And so even though it's different kings, you'll see the same lessons and things about them multiple times. So already in Daniel 1 and 2, we have seen that Daniel has a powerful faith in God, right? He's not going to defile himself with the food. He's going to stand up and he's going to interpret the dreams. So, he's basically saying nobody can do this, but God can do this through me, right? And so he has a powerful faith in God. So we have good reason already to think that Daniel and anybody else related to him is not going to worship any other God. And still, Nebuchadnezzar behaves as if this is the first time he's hearing about that, right? He is not aware of any of that. And he's unaware of God's power or the convictions of his people. So later on, Daniel will be in a similar situation. There's lots of parallels between the fiery furnace and the lion's den story, but Daniel's in a similar situation. And you would think, even though it's a different king, that somebody would have shared a thing or two about the God of Israel and why this stuff that doesn't really work out for them, right? It didn't work out in the blazing furnace. It's not going to work out in the lion's den. And so this might be further evidence that the book of Daniel, again, is probably compiled oral stories that make their way and kind of get put together. Because if you were writing this just from start to finish, you have Nebuchadnezzar with a redeeming moment in chapter 2. And so if you were going to continue that story, he may continue with that sort of characterization. That moment might stick with him. He's learned a lesson. He doesn't have to learn it again. But no, you open up chapter 3 and he's just as ignorant and arrogant as ever, as if he's never heard of this stuff before. So again, these stories were probably separate, orally passed around, and then compiled. And the compiler doesn't concern themselves with, hey, these don't always match up perfectly. Like he would have learned this lesson, but we're just going to go with it. Verse 15. Now when you hear the sound of, here we go, the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipe, and all kinds of music, if you are ready to fall down and worship the image I made, very good. But if you do not worship it, you will be thrown immediately into a blazing furnace. Then what God will be able to rescue you from my hand? Just imagine Nebuchadnezzar's arrogance right there. So he obviously believes that he is above any human power because apparently, according to him, it would be up to a God to rescue you if you're going to get rescued. No one on earth is capable, and he's totally convinced that there's no human limit to his authority. And just like last week, we had this a little bit last week, this last line, what God can rescue you, it should be like the author is like kind of got a little bit of a wink towards the reader, if that makes any sense. Because Nebuchadnezzar thinks that's a rhetorical question. We actually do know the answer to that, right? And so what God can rescue you? Well, we know that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego's God can do that. We have information. The author has information. Nebuchadnezzar is the one who's in the dark. Verse 16. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to him, King Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to deliver us from it, and he will deliver us from your majesty's hand. But even if he does not, oh man, like one of the most powerful lines in the whole book maybe. Even if he does not, we're going to come back to that at the end. But even if he does not, we want you to know, your majesty, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you have set up. Then Nebuchadnezzar was furious with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and his attitude toward them changed. He ordered the furnace heated 7 times hotter than usual. So 7 times hotter was probably impossible, just to be honest with you. So people think that the average temperature of these furnaces would have been about 1,000 degrees, and really 7,000 degrees is just not possible at that time to do that. So what do we know also about the number 7 though? It's complete, right? It's whole, perfect, complete, that sort of thing. So the author is probably telling us that the heat in the furnace was complete. It was as hot as it could go, right? To its capacity. He ordered the furnace heated 7 times hotter than usual and commanded some of the strongest soldiers in his army to tie up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and threw them into the blazing furnace. So these men, wearing their robes, trousers, turbans, and other clothes, that'll be important later, were bound and thrown into the blazing furnace. The king's command was so urgent and the furnace so hot that the flames of the fire killed the soldiers who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So remember, Nebuchadnezzar's kind of like a crazy villain right now. He's a little bit absurd. And so in his urgency to heat things up so hot because he's that filled with rage, it literally backfires on his own men, right? And so this is the way that the king views his own power, and this might be a lesson that the author wants us to see. He's so blind with power and rage, blind to the power of the true God, that it costs him his own people in this part. It says, and these 3 men, firmly tied, fell into the blazing furnace. Then King Nebuchadnezzar leapt to his feet in amazement and asked his advisors, weren't there 3 men we tied up and threw into the fire? They replied, certainly, your majesty. He said, look, I see 4 men walking around in the fire, unbound and unharmed, and the 4th looks like a son of the gods. Can we talk about something a little touchy tonight? I'm getting a couple of nods. No? Yes? No? All right, good. I just want to make sure. So we look at this scripture now, and we think, oh, Jesus was there, right? Son of the gods. Oh, Jesus was, and I've heard that so many times, not just from anybody. I mean, I've heard pastors say that. I've heard it from a lot of people. That must be Jesus. So we shouldn't confuse Nebuchadnezzar's phrase, a son of the gods, with our New Testament phrase about Jesus, the Son of God. So, son of the gods is really a way to refer to something that is supernatural. So we talked about this a bit more this morning. And if you were to think of I don't know tons about Babylonian religion, but if you put it in like the Greek religion standpoint, son of the gods is not out of place there. So you would think of like a demigod, you would think of like Achilles and people like that. And so it's not out of place in these kind of pagan religions to use that sort of phrase, son of the gods. And so remember, this is coming out of the mouth of Nebuchadnezzar. So he's not going to refer to something that's so uniquely Jewish as the coming expectation for the Messiah, right? So to him, there's some sort of lesser heavenly being that has apparently been sent by Yahweh. So in fact, a few hundred years after the time of Daniel, there was an effort to translate the Old Testament into Greek. Again, the Old Testament is in Hebrew, and this little part's in Aramaic. They want to translate it into Greek a few hundred years later. It's called the Septuagint, if you've heard that before. And when they translate this story into Greek, they remove any ambiguity for what Nebuchadnezzar says. And what he actually says in Greek is, it's an angel of God. So he never says son of the gods in Greek. He says angel of God. So they see this kind of confusion, and they just go ahead and put angel of God for what Nebuchadnezzar is saying. Now, I'm not saying this couldn't be Jesus, because how in the world would I know, right? But as important as it is that we look at the Old Testament in light of Jesus, it's also important that we look at the Old Testament in the way that the early readers would have experienced these stories as well. And so they're not reading Daniel 3 and thinking, oh my gosh, that must have been God's son, the Messiah. How did we miss that one? That's not what they're thinking. They're reading the story and thinking there was some supernatural assistance here, right? And of course, they have heavenly messengers and helpers throughout their whole history. So for them, this is just another occurrence. If you think of someone like Michael, for instance, like an angel like Michael. So could it be Jesus? Sure. Would that be really cool? Absolutely. But here's the point. Here's why I bring all that up. I think we have to be really, really careful declaring something that the Bible actually doesn't say. You can believe this is Jesus, and that's fine. But we can't say it definitely is Jesus because that's not what Daniel says. Does that make sense? I think we get ourselves into trouble when we do stuff like that, and the Bible doesn't actually say that. And we'll come back. That'll come back one more time. Verse 26. Nebuchadnezzar then approached the opening of the blazing furnace and shouted, "Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out, come here." So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out of the fire, and the satraps, prefects, governors, and royal advisors crowded around them. They saw that the fire had not harmed their bodies, nor was a hair of their heads singed. Their robes were not scorched, and there was no smell of fire on them. So earlier, the author was careful to tell you about their clothes. Well, now this is the payoff for that, right? Their clothes are not even burned. Verse 28, then Nebuchadnezzar said, "Praise be to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who sent his angel," right? So again, we go back to this whole idea of son of the gods, but it says right here when they go back to that part, sent his angel. God sent his angel and rescued his servants. They trusted in him and defied the king's command and were willing to give up their lives rather than serve or worship any god except their own God. So I love it. Listen to Nebuchadnezzar's reversal here, right? So before he's this arrogant kind of villain, and now he's like congratulating them for defying his own command. It's pretty crazy. 29. Therefore, I decree that the people of any nation or language who say anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be cut into pieces and their houses be turned into piles of rubble, for no other God can save this way. If you remember from last week, Nebuchadnezzar apparently has a favorite punishment. Do you remember? Have you seen this? Do you remember this from last week? Yes, no, maybe. This was the punishment of the wise men who could not interpret the dream correctly. And so it's the exact same thing. Cut into pieces, their houses turned into rubble. So he has like a favorite punishment. Also, Nebuchadnezzar praises God. And then he says a lot of great things about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Does Nebuchadnezzar convert? He praises God, says a lot of great things about them. Do you think he converts? No. So remember we had this word a few weeks ago as well, monolatry. So this is a way to describe most of what you see in terms of the religions of the ancient world. So the belief in the existence of multiple deities coupled with the consistent, exclusive worship of only one chosen God. And the example that I used is kind of like other gods is almost like traveling into other jurisdictions. So here in my land, I serve these gods and they take care of me and we do just fine. If I travel over here, I'll probably give homage to these gods and they take care of that land really well as well, right? And so it's kind of like traveling from place to place. They can believe in all sorts of different gods and they're probably going to serve the nation's God where they are at, right? And so Nebuchadnezzar doesn't convert. He just recognizes, hey, Israel has a God and he did really good stuff for them, right? And in verse 30, we wrap it up. The king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. So it kind of ends a little bit like Daniel's story as well. We see Daniel kind of victorious after all of his stuff going on, and then he's promoted, and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they are promoted as well. So here's my kind of so what sort of section tonight. What is this? How do we take this? What does this kind of mean for us? How do we live this out? So I want to talk about what's probably the best and most challenging line in the whole story. Even if he does not, right? Even if he does not. So what does it take for us to have even if he doesn't sort of faith? Isn't that just a wild, wild thing for me to think that they would have enough faith to see that in front of them and say, nope, I'm good, my God will save me. And then to go a step beyond that and say, actually, I don't know if he'll save me, but I'm still not going to do what you want me to do. Isn't that wild? How do you have even if faith? What does it take for you to trust God's goodness and faithfulness, even if he doesn't always do what you want him to do? So this past Sunday, we talked about what do we do with unanswered prayer, right? That was what the sermon was all about. And so building a faith on a God on who God is and not just what God does, right? And so that's kind of what we talked about on Sunday. And so one thing the exiles knew was that you cannot have this even if he doesn't sort of faith without being doggedly committed and faithful to another reality altogether. The idea that there is something outside of this realm and what we see in front of us is not all there is. So I think that's what they have to have. And this would be so infuriating to Nebuchadnezzar because he can assume he's the King of Kings and he can exact any sort of punishments that he wants on anybody in this world. But if somebody defies you because they have a belief in another whole reality, well, how do you challenge that, right? You never really have power over them because they're like, whatever, kill me. I believe in something else altogether. So I would imagine that for somebody who thinks they're all powerful, that would be infuriating. That would be such a dissatisfying execution for him, if that makes any sense. So something really, really important. Let me kind of take a little bit of a dive here. Something really important about the exile is that it redefines this particular belief that God's people would have had about the future. So there's a big $10 word that we learned in seminary. The word is eschatology. Eschatology is basically the idea that this is all ultimately headed somewhere. There is a reality out there. There's a place that we're going. There's a time, whatever it is. There's a reality that this is all headed somewhere. So what's interesting is you see eschatology throughout the Old Testament, but you see the end that it points to kind of shift as you go through different experiences of the people of God. So I'll give you some examples. Early in the Old Testament, as Israel first enters the Promised Land, there are certain blessings that they can look forward to in the future. So this is the ultimate end that they are looking forward to. And it says this in Deuteronomy. Here's what God will do. The Lord will establish you as his holy people, as he promised you on oath. If you keep the commands of the Lord your God and walk in obedience to him, then all the peoples on earth will see that you are called by the name of the Lord, and they will fear you. The Lord, this is the really important part, the Lord will grant you abundant prosperity in the fruit of your womb, the young of your livestock, and the crops of your ground, and the land he swore to your ancestors to give you. So, their idea of eschatology, the ultimate end, the great future that they're headed to, looks something like this. But notice this, it looks like a lot of blessings on this earth. So it's all around prosperity, but as we would experience prosperity here on earth. So, fruit of your womb, young of your livestock, crops of your ground, the land he swore to your ancestors to give you. That's the greatest ultimate end they can think of at the time. We see that sort of idea continue in the prophet Amos. So Amos writes after Israel is divided, but this is before any exile had happened, right? So in that divided kingdom era. And so their biggest problem was not that they were weak and conquered. Their biggest problem was unfaithfulness and moral corruption. And so Amos prophesies, and he speaks for God, is basically what that means, about the ultimate end. And here's the ultimate end for Amos, or really for God, who Amos is speaking through. For I will give the command, and I will shake the people of Israel among all the nations, as grain is shaken in a sieve, and not a pebble will reach the ground. All the sinners among my people will die by the sword. Again, this is all about moral corruption and what will happen to them. All those who say disaster will not overtake or meet us. Here's the important part. In that day, I will restore David's fallen shelter, repair its broken walls, restore its ruins, and rebuild it as it used to be. So again, eschatology, the ultimate end, the great future out there, is all about things that can happen here. And in fact, things that have happened in their past. So they want to go back to the good old days. That is their great and glorious future that they're headed to. Before the exile, this is very much focused on the things of this world. All about the promised land, all about David's kingdom. But listen to how things change during and after the exile. Stick with me just for a second. I would imagine the exile really shook any faith that they had in themselves and in their own power, right? Because they are just conquered and at someone else's whim. They probably realize how small of a nation they are, and they're at the whim of other powers. And so anything about earthly strength cannot be counted on for them. And so their eschatology now begins to look beyond this world. Their great and glorious future is outside this world in another reality. So Malachi, after the exile, says this. This is kind of a long passage. On the day when I act, right? So it's a forward-looking day, says the Lord Almighty. They will be my treasured possession. I will spare them just as a father has compassion and spares his son who serves him. And you will again see the distinction between the righteous and the wicked, between those who serve God and those who do not. Surely the day is coming, it will burn like a furnace. All the arrogant and every evildoer will be stubble, and the day that is coming will set them on fire, says the Lord Almighty. Not a root or branch will be left to them, but for you who revere my name, the Son of Righteousness will rise with healing in its rays, and you will go out and frolic like well-fed calves. Then he will trample on the wicked. They will be ashes under the soles of your feet on the day when I act, says the Lord Almighty. Remember the law of my servant Moses, the decrees and laws I gave him at Horeb for all of Israel. See, I will send the prophet Elijah to you before that great and dreadful day of the Lord. Day of the Lord is something they come back to. He will turn the hearts of their parents to the children, the hearts of the children to their parents, or else I will come and strike the land with total destruction. So, eschatology now, during and after the exile, is about a great day that is coming, a future day of the Lord, a day of like final judgment. So again, the focus shifts from here's what it looks like to be prosperous here to we're going to bank on a whole other reality, a whole other future, something that's kind of outside of this world. So back to our point, a staple belief among the exiles is now a world unlike ours is on its way. So they can't rely on the promised land. They can't rely on their best kings. All that's been taken away from them. So their promised future shifts from success and prosperity in this world, like we saw in Deuteronomy, to a coming and final judgment where the faithful are blessed by a God who is beyond any other God. And so with that in mind, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they can say to Nebuchadnezzar, even if he does not save us, there's still so much going on here that we're fine, right? The New Testament, you see Paul talk about how much he doesn't know about what's to come, and he talks really about eschatology, and Paul says this, for now we see only a reflection as in a mirror, then we shall see face to face. Now I know in part, then I shall know fully, even as I am fully known. So again, world unlike ours. And then, of course, this sort of belief goes beyond the New Testament. This is the sort of belief that the martyrs would have had during persecution, because you can't stand there in the face of certain death and keep hold of your faith if you don't believe something entirely different is on its way out there. So, do we have an even if faith? A faith that says even if things don't go well, even if I'm not healed, even if life is tough, even if my prayers go unanswered, even if my depression and anxiety just kind of hangs around with me, right? I'm going to stake my faith on the idea that there is something so much bigger out there. There's an eternity with Jesus that I believe will make all the things of this world pale in comparison to what we experience then. And so I can endure whatever I have to here because that reality is on the way. So let me end with, there's a line from an old hymn that captures this perfectly. The hymn is called Come Ye Disconsolate. Disconsolate means somebody who just won't be comforted. So come those who won't be comforted. And the line is, earth has no sorrow that heaven cannot heal. So again, that's that eschatology. There's something different that we're looking forward to. We can stand in the face of a blazing furnace. We can be persecuted like the martyrs. Whatever can happen to us in this world it pales in comparison because of what we believe is on its way. This is the faith of the exiles, and that's how they can say, even if he does not save us, right?